The throne chamber of the Veloran Empire was designed to inspire awe and probably mild terror. Vaulted ceilings stretched upward into shadows, where decorative lights floated like captured stars. Pillars carved from single pieces of stone from the Veloran homeworld's ancient quarries, Jake had been told during the brief tour, rose at precise intervals, each one inscribed with historical texts in a language his translator could only partially decode. The floor was polished to mirror smoothness, reflecting everything above it and making the room feel impossibly vast. Ambassador Jake Morrison stood at the base of the throne platform, trying very hard to look like he belonged there, like he was the kind of diplomat who routinely addressed alien queens in chambers that could comfortably fit a small stadium. He was not that kind of diplomat. He was a mid-level attaché who'd been promoted to this mission approximately 72 hours ago when the actual chief ambassador had come down with a mysterious stomach ailment that the medical staff was still trying to diagnose. Jake suspected food poisoning from that questionable restaurant in the station's market district, but nobody had asked his opinion. Queen Lyriel sat on her throne like she'd been carved from the same ancient stone as the pillars, radiating authority that made Jake want to apologize for existing. She was tall even seated, with the distinctive long tapered ears of her species rising from her skull in elegant points. Her skin shifted with subtle iridescent patterns that Jake's briefing materials had explained were emotional indicators, though the materials had been frustratingly vague about what specific patterns meant. Right now her skin displayed flowing silver and blue patterns that suggested something. Impatience maybe, boredom, murderous intent. Jake had no idea. The throne chamber was packed with courtiers and advisors, and what Jake assumed were nobles of various ranks, all watching him with the kind of attention usually reserved for entertainment or public executions. 6 other ambassadors had already completed their audiences with the Queen, representatives from 6 allied species who'd supported the Veloran Empire during their recent military conflict. Each had been granted a wish by Queen Lyriel, a magnanimous gesture celebrating the Empire's victory over a rival faction that had threatened their borders for decades. Jake had watched the other ambassadors receive their gifts. The Kreth representative wished for territorial rights to a contested star system and received them. The Mordian ambassador requested exclusive trade agreements and was granted favorable terms that would make her civilization wealthy for generations. The others had asked for technology transfers, military alliances, guaranteed supply lines, all strategic, all beneficial to their species for decades to come. Humanity's contribution to the conflict had been minimal. Some supply ships, some intelligence sharing, nothing that would have turned the tide of battle or changed the war's outcome. But Queen Lyriel had insisted on honoring all allies equally, and now it was Jake's turn to ask for something that would benefit Earth for generations. Except Jake was completely, catastrophically unprepared for this responsibility. His briefing had covered proper protocol for greeting the Queen, appropriate posture for addressing royalty, and the correct way to back out of the throne chamber without tripping over his own feet. Nobody had mentioned that he'd be expected to make decisions affecting humanity's future. That was supposed to be the chief ambassador's job. The actual diplomat with decades of experience and political connections, and the kind of strategic mind that could calculate advantages 6 moves ahead. Jake's strategic mind was currently screaming in panic and suggesting he fake a medical emergency. Ambassador Morrison. Queen Lyriel's voice cut through his internal crisis with the precision of a blade. You have been granted the honor of one wish within my power to fulfill. What does humanity desire? Every head in the throne chamber turned toward him. Jake felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. His mouth went dry. His carefully memorized greeting speech evaporated from his memory entirely. What did humanity desire? 1,000 things. Resources, territory, technology, alliances, security, prosperity. The list was endless, and Jake's superiors back on Earth would have very specific opinions about which items should be prioritized. His communicator vibrated against his wrist, messages probably, urgent instructions that had finally made it through the communication delays. But he couldn't check them now, not while Queen Lyriel was watching him with those unreadable eyes, and those shifting skin patterns that might mean she was about to rescind the offer out of sheer impatience. Jake opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it again, feeling his face heat with embarrassment. Queen Lyriel's expression didn't change, but something in her skin patterns shifted toward darker blues. Definitely impatience, possibly contempt. Jake started, then stopped. Your Majesty, I apologize. This honor was unexpected. Might I request a brief time to consider my response? The request was apparently unusual based on the whispers that rippled through the assembled courtiers. Queen Lyriel's ears tilted slightly, surprise, according to the briefing materials, or possibly irritation. Jake really wished the briefing materials had been more specific. You need time to consider what your species desires. The Queen's tone carried disbelief. The other ambassadors knew immediately. The other ambassadors were prepared for this honor, Your Majesty. I was not. Jake forced himself to maintain eye contact despite every instinct screaming at him to look away from that imperial stare. I want to give you a worthy answer, not a hasty one. Queen Lyriel studied him for what felt like several geological epochs. Then she made a gesture that seemed casual, but probably carried immense significance that Jake would learn about later when reviewing recordings of this disaster. You may have 1 hour to consider. Return to this chamber with your decision. Thank you, Your Majesty. Jake executed what he hoped was an appropriate bow and backed away from the throne platform without falling, which he considered a minor victory given how badly his legs were shaking. The palace gardens were quieter than the throne chamber, but no less intimidating. Precisely manicured paths wound between plants from a dozen worlds, arranged in patterns that probably had deep cultural significance. Jake was too stressed to appreciate. He found a bench that overlooked the capital city and sat heavily, finally checking his communicator. 17 messages, all marked urgent, all from increasingly senior officials back on Earth who'd apparently just learned that their mid-level attaché was about to make decisions affecting humanity's place in galactic politics. Request territorial rights to Sector 447, critical for expansion, trade agreements, focus on technology transfer, military alliance, guaranteed mutual defense. Each message was more emphatic than the last, each one demanding he secure something that would benefit humanity for generations. Each one was from someone who outranked him significantly and would remember if he failed. Jake stared at the messages without really reading them. His mind had snagged on something else entirely, something he'd seen yesterday during the ceremonial tour of the capital city. The tour was supposed to showcase the Empire's achievements. Grand architecture, advanced technology, cultural treasures spanning centuries. But Jake's guide, a young Veloran official whose name Jake had already forgotten, had made a navigational error and led them through the lower districts by mistake. The contrast with the palace district had been jarring. Buildings that needed repair, infrastructure that looked decades out of date, streets crowded with Veloran citizens who looked tired and worried rather than prosperous and secure. The guide had been mortified, quickly redirecting their route back to the approved showcase areas. But Jake had insisted on seeing more of the real city, curious about how ordinary Velorans actually lived. What he'd seen hadn't been poverty exactly. The Veloran Empire was wealthy and powerful, but that wealth clearly wasn't distributed evenly. In the lower districts, schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Housing barely met safety standards. The infrastructure that supported ordinary citizens' daily lives was crumbling, while the Empire poured resources into military expansion and maintaining its power. Jake had met a teacher, a female Veloran with tired eyes and determined expression, who'd shown him her classroom with obvious pride despite its inadequacies. 50 students in a space designed for 20. Educational materials that were outdated and insufficient, equipment that barely functioned. "We do our best," she'd said in halting standard. "We teach with what we have, but the children deserve better." He'd met a medical worker who'd been on shift for 20 hours straight because the facility was understaffed, who'd shown him equipment that was generations behind what he'd seen in the palace medical wing, who'd explained that they triaged cases and some people waited days for treatment that should be immediate. "The Empire is powerful," the medic had said quietly, "but power does not always reach those who need it most." Jake had wanted to do something to help somehow, but what could a random human diplomat do about Veloran domestic policy? It wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He was here to represent humanity's interests, not to worry about how the Veloran Empire managed its own citizens. Except now, he sat in a garden looking at a city where half the population lived in conditions that didn't match the Empire's wealth and power, and Queen Lyriel had just offered him anything within her power to grant. His communicator buzzed again. Another message, this one from the Secretary General himself. "Secure maximum advantage. Do not disappoint US." Jake looked at the message, looked at the city below, thought about the teacher's classroom with 50 students and inadequate materials, thought about the medical facility turning people away because they didn't have capacity, thought about what kind of person he wanted to be when he looked at himself in the mirror tomorrow. "This is a terrible idea," he said aloud to the garden. "This is going to get me fired." But he knew what he was going to wish for. The walk back to the throne chamber felt simultaneously too long and too short. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were sweating. Every reasonable part of his brain screamed that he was about to make a catastrophic mistake, that he should listen to his superiors, that he should think strategically about humanity's long-term interests. But he couldn't stop thinking about that teacher's face when she'd shown him the classroom and said the children deserved better. Queen Lyriel was waiting on her throne, her skin patterns suggesting something. Jake still couldn't read them properly. The throne chamber had emptied somewhat. The other ambassadors had left with their prizes, and only the Queen's closest advisors and the ceremonial witnesses remained. "Have you decided, Ambassador Morrison?" The Queen's tone suggested he should have decided immediately, and this whole requesting time thing had been a tiresome waste of everyone's energy. Jake approached the throne platform, his prepared speech already crumbling in his mind. He'd spent the entire walk back rehearsing what to say, how to phrase this, how to make it sound less insane than it was. None of that preparation mattered now. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected, "I have considered humanity's needs carefully, and I have made my decision." Queen Lyriel leaned forward slightly, attention focused. The advisors leaned in as well, clearly curious what this human would request, probably expecting something about territory or technology, something to match the other ambassadors' wishes. Jake took a breath and committed professional suicide. "I wish for you to redirect the resources you would have spent on whatever gift you were planning to give humanity, territory, technology, trade agreements, whatever it was, and instead invest those resources in your own people, specifically in the lower districts of your cities, in medical facilities and schools and infrastructure that serves ordinary Veloran citizens." The silence that followed was so profound Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Queen Lyriel stared at him like he'd suddenly started speaking in a language her translator couldn't process. Her skin patterns flickered through several rapid changes: shock, confusion, something darker that might have been anger. Her advisors looked equally stunned, frozen in postures of disbelief. "You wish for..." Queen Lyriel's voice was carefully controlled, but Jake could hear something dangerous underneath. "Nothing. You wish for me to spend resources on my own people, rather than giving anything to humanity." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Explain." It wasn't a request. Jake's mouth was desert dry, but he pushed forward. Yesterday I saw your lower districts. Your people are struggling while the empire expands. Children are being educated in overcrowded classrooms with inadequate materials. Medical facilities can't treat everyone who needs help. Infrastructure is failing. He met her eyes, knowing this was probably ending his career but unable to stop. Your empire is powerful and wealthy, but that wealth isn't reaching everyone. Your citizens deserve better. One of the Queen's advisors leaned in, whispering urgently. She waved him away without looking, her attention locked on Jake. You were offered anything within my power to grant. Territory your species has wanted for decades. Technology that would advance your civilization by generations. Trade agreements that would make your world wealthy. Her skin patterns were cycling through colors Jake had never seen, and he had no idea what they meant. And you're refusing all of it to ask me to help my own people. Yes, Your Majesty. Why? The question was simple but weighted with genuine confusion that penetrated her imperial composure. Jake considered his answer carefully, knowing this was the moment that would define how his choice was remembered. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I met a teacher yesterday who's trying to educate 50 students with resources for 20, and she told me they deserve better. Because I saw a medical worker who'd been on shift for 20 hours treating people with equipment that's generations out of date. Because your empire is powerful, but that power isn't reaching everyone who needs it. He paused, gathering courage for the next part. And because if humanity accepts gifts while your people struggle in the districts below your palace, we're saying that our advancement matters more than their well-being. I can't make that choice in good conscience. I won't represent humanity by standing on the backs of people who need help. Queen Lyriel stood from her throne, a fluid motion that made her seem even taller and more imposing. She descended the steps toward Jake, and every instinct screamed at him to back away from her advancing presence. He held his ground through sheer stubbornness and possibly fear-induced paralysis. When she reached him, she stopped close enough that Jake had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. Her skin patterns had settled into something complex he couldn't begin to interpret. Ambassador Morrison. Her voice was quiet now, intense. In 500 years of my dynasty, no one has ever made such a wish. No one has ever refused personal or species gain to ask for aid to be given to someone else. She studied him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. You understand that by making this wish, you have potentially damaged Earth's standing. Your superiors will be displeased with this outcome. Probably, Jake admitted. His voice wanted to shake, but he forced it steady. But I'd rather be fired for doing the right thing than promoted for making a choice I couldn't live with. Something flickered in Queen Lyriel's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly respect. Her skin patterns shifted again, settling into colors that seemed thoughtful, contemplative rather than angry. She returned to her throne with the same fluid grace, settling into it with an expression that had transformed from imperial irritation to something far more complex. Very well, Ambassador Morrison, your wish is granted. Her voice carried through the chamber with absolute authority. I will redirect resources to domestic infrastructure and social programs as you have requested. The lower districts will be rebuilt. Schools and medical facilities will receive proper funding. She paused, and something that might have been amusement touched her expression. And you will return to your superiors empty-handed, having refused gifts that would have benefited your entire species. Yes, Your Majesty. You are dismissed. Jake bowed and turned to leave, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settling into his bones. He'd thrown away humanity's biggest opportunity in decades. His career was over. His superiors would be furious. History would probably remember him as the diplomat who catastrophically fumbled first contact with the Veloran Empire. But he'd also maybe helped people who needed it. Children who'd get better classrooms. Medical facilities that could treat everyone who needed care. Infrastructure that would make ordinary Veloran citizens' lives better. That had to count for something, even if he was about to get fired for it. Ambassador. Jake stopped at Queen Lyriel's voice, turned back to face her. Her expression was unreadable, but her skin patterns had shifted to something warmer. You have given me much to consider, more than you perhaps realize. It wasn't absolution or approval, but it wasn't condemnation either. Jake bowed again and left the throne chamber, wondering what he'd just set in motion. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and Jake spent most of it avoiding his communicator. The messages had started within hours of his audience with Queen Lyriel, first confused inquiries from his immediate superiors, then increasingly angry demands for explanation from higher-ups. Finally, a tersely worded summons to report directly to the diplomatic corps headquarters upon arrival. He knew what was coming: demotion at minimum, probably termination, possibly some kind of formal censure that would make him unemployable in diplomatic circles for the rest of his career. He'd thrown away the opportunity of a lifetime, refused gifts that could have benefited billions of humans, and spent those resources on aliens who weren't his responsibility. The other passengers on the transport gave him strange looks. Word had spread about what he'd done. Nothing. Some looked at him with pity, others with contempt, a few with something that might have been confused admiration, though they never said anything directly. Jake spent his time reviewing what he'd done, trying to figure out if he'd make the same choice again. Every time he thought about it, he came back to the teacher's face when she'd shown him her overcrowded classroom, the medical worker's exhausted expression after a 20-hour shift, the ordinary Veloran citizens living in conditions that didn't match their empire's wealth. He'd make the same choice, even knowing the consequences, even knowing he'd destroyed his career for it. That realization was either comforting or deeply concerning, and Jake hadn't decided which. Earth orbit looked the same as always, crowded with stations and satellites, and the organized chaos of humanity's presence in space. Jake's transport docked at the main diplomatic station, and he was immediately escorted to a conference room where 5 very senior officials waited with expressions that ranged from disappointed to furious. The debrief was brutal. They went through his decision point by point, making him explain his reasoning, questioning his judgment, documenting his failure for the official record. Ambassador Chen, a woman whose diplomatic career spanned 40 years and who Jake had always admired, looked at him with such disappointment that it hurt worse than the anger from the others. "You had one job, Morrison," she said quietly. "Secure benefits for humanity. Instead, you gave away our opportunity to help aliens solve their own domestic problems. Problems that aren't our responsibility or our concern. With respect, Ambassador, I disagree that they aren't our concern," Jake said, knowing he was making things worse but unable to stop. "We were offered a gift built on the suffering of people who needed help. I couldn't accept that. That's not your decision to make. You're a diplomat, not a charity worker. You represent humanity's interests, not your personal ethics." "I thought humanity's interests included not building our prosperity on others' suffering." The silence that followed was ice cold. Ambassador Chen shook her head slowly. "You're reassigned to administrative duties, effective immediately. You'll be processing visa applications in the Mars Colony office. You're lucky we're not terminating your employment entirely." Jake had expected this, but hearing it officially still felt like a punch to the gut. Mars Colony office. The diplomatic equivalent of being exiled to a supply closet, processing paperwork for colonists who wanted to visit Earth. It was career death, just slightly slower than outright firing. "I understand," he said quietly. "You're dismissed. Report to your new assignment within the week." Jake left the conference room, collected his minimal belongings from his now former office, and tried to figure out what came next. He'd sacrificed his career for a principle, and now he had to live with the consequences. The news coverage was mixed. Some outlets portrayed him as an idealistic fool who'd thrown away humanity's interests. Others suggested he'd been incompetent, panicked under pressure, made an emotional decision rather than a strategic one. A few, a very few, wondered if maybe he'd seen something everyone else had missed, if maybe there was wisdom in choosing compassion over advantage. Most people just thought he was an idiot. Jake spent 2 months processing visa applications on Mars, living in cramped colony housing, watching his former colleagues advance their careers while his stagnated. He tried not to be bitter about it. He'd made his choice. He'd live with it. Then, 6 months after his disastrous audience with Queen Lyriel, everything changed. The message came through official diplomatic channels, marked with priority codes that made the Mars colony administrator personally deliver it to Jake's tiny office. "You've got a communication from the Veloran Empire," the administrator said, looking confused and slightly awed. "From Queen Lyriel herself, requesting you specifically." Jake's heart stopped. "Requesting me for what?" "She wants you as the human ambassador for ongoing diplomatic relations. Not any ambassador. You, specifically." The administrator handed over the formal communication, and Jake read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. But the words didn't change. Queen Lyriel was requesting Jake Morrison as humanity's official ambassador to the Veloran Empire. The request came with enough diplomatic weight that Earth's government had no practical choice but to comply. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said aloud. "I failed, I wasted the wish. Why would she want me back?" "No idea," the administrator said. "But you're being recalled to Earth immediately. Pack your things." The trip back to Earth was surreal. The same officials who demoted him 6 months ago were now awkwardly congratulating him on his new posting. Ambassador Chen looked puzzled but approving. Nobody knew what to make of the situation. Jake didn't know what to make of it either. When he arrived back at the Veloran homeworld, this time on an official diplomatic transport with proper ceremony, the changes were immediately visible. Even from orbit, he could see construction throughout the capital city. The lower districts that had looked worn and struggling before now gleamed with renovation projects. A Veloran official met him at the docking port. Not the nervous young guide from his first visit, but a senior diplomatic aide who treated Jake with respect that seemed wildly disproportionate to his actual rank. "Ambassador Morrison, welcome back. Queen Lyriel is eager to meet with you." "I'm not actually an ambassador," Jake said automatically. "I'm just..." Queen Lyriel was quite specific. "You are to be addressed as ambassador. Earth has confirmed your appointment." They'd confirmed his appointment because they had no choice. You didn't refuse when a powerful alien queen specifically requested someone. But Jake had no idea why she'd requested him. Why she'd want the diplomat who'd embarrassed humanity by refusing her gifts. The drive through the city gave him more time to observe the changes. The lower districts were transformed. New schools with modern facilities. Medical centers with updated equipment and expanded capacity. Housing that looked safe and well-maintained. Infrastructure that actually functioned properly. The teacher's classroom, the one that had haunted Jake's thoughts for 6 months, had been completely rebuilt. Through the windows, he could see students working in a space that wasn't overcrowded, with materials that weren't outdated, with an environment that actually supported learning. The Queen moved quickly on infrastructure improvements, the diplomatic aide explained, noticing Jake's attention. She redirected significant resources from military expansion to domestic programs. The lower districts have been priority focus. "Because of my wish," Jake said quietly, still processing what he was seeing. "Because of your wish," the aide confirmed. "You have made significant impact, Ambassador Morrison. My children attend one of the rebuilt schools. The quality of their education has improved dramatically. My family is grateful." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He'd made a choice that felt right in the moment, not expecting to see the results, not expecting to be thanked for it. The palace gardens were just as he remembered, though the view of the city below had changed dramatically. Queen Lyriel was waiting at the same overlook where Jake had made his decision 6 months ago, standing with her back to the approach, looking out over her capital. "Ambassador Morrison," she said without turning. "Thank you for returning." "Your Majesty requested my presence. I came." Jake approached carefully, unsure of the protocol for this situation. "Though I confess I don't understand why you'd want me back after what I did." "After what you did?" Queen Lyriel turned to face him, and her skin patterns shifted through colors that Jake was slowly learning to read. Thoughtful blues, warm ambers, something complex he still couldn't identify. "You mean after you made a wish that forced me to confront my own failures as a ruler?" She gestured for him to join her at the overlook. "I have spent 6 months thinking about why you made that wish. About what it revealed, not just about you but about me." Jake stood beside her, looking at the transformed city below. "I didn't mean to criticize." "But you did criticize, appropriately." The Queen's ears tilted, and what Jake was learning meant rueful acknowledgement. "I had been so focused on military expansion and maintaining the empire that I stopped looking at my own people's needs. I knew the lower districts struggled, but I told myself it was acceptable cost of imperial power. That maintaining military strength mattered more than domestic comfort." She was quiet for a moment, her skin patterns shifting thoughtfully. "Then a human ambassador stood in my throne chamber and refused gifts that would benefit his entire species because he'd seen my people suffering. Because he'd met one teacher and one medical worker and decided their well-being mattered more than his own advancement." "I didn't think about it that strategically," Jake admitted. "I just couldn't accept gifts while knowing people needed help." "Exactly." Queen Lyriel's expression was intent. "You made a choice based on compassion rather than calculation, on what was right rather than what was advantageous. And that choice showed me that I had failed my people by prioritizing empire over their welfare." She turned to fully face him. "You taught me something, Ambassador Morrison, that true power isn't just about conquest and expansion. That strength includes taking care of those you're responsible for. That a ruler who ignores her people's suffering in pursuit of military glory is failing in her most fundamental duty." Jake felt heat rising in his face. "Your Majesty, I'm sure you would have realized." "Perhaps eventually. But you accelerated that realization. You made it impossible for me to ignore what I had been deliberately not seeing." Her skin patterns shifted to warm amber. "Redirecting resources to domestic infrastructure has strengthened my empire more than any military victory could have. My people trust me now in ways they didn't before. They see that I care about their well-being, not just about expansion and power. That trust has made us genuinely stronger." She gestured back toward the palace. "Walk with me. I have something to show you." They walked through the gardens in silence that felt contemplative rather than uncomfortable. Queen Lyriel led Jake to a wing of the palace he hadn't seen before, a gallery filled with portraits and historical artifacts. "This is the Hall of Wisdom," she explained. "It contains images and stories of those who have taught my dynasty important lessons, advisors who gave crucial counsel, enemies who revealed weaknesses, allies who showed new perspectives." She stopped before an empty space on the wall. "I am commissioning a portrait of you to be placed here." Jake stared at the empty space. "Your Majesty, I don't deserve." "You deserve recognition for teaching me something 500 years of advisors had not managed to convey. That compassion and wisdom sometimes mean refusing what's offered. That seeing beyond self-interest to genuine need is rare and valuable." She smiled slightly. "Also, you have become something of a folk hero in the lower districts. The teacher you met, her name is Vela, by the way, has been telling everyone about the human ambassador who wished for their children to have better schools. You are quite popular among ordinary Velorans." "I just made one choice," Jake protested. "One moment of seeing what needed to be done. One choice that changed how I rule my empire. One moment that led to millions of my people living better lives." Queen Lyriel's expression was serious now. "Do not diminish what you accomplished, Ambassador Morrison. Your wish asked for nothing for yourself or your species, and in doing so, You achieved more than any strategic calculation could have managed. She led him back outside, toward a terrace that overlooked the city. I am offering Earth a comprehensive alliance. Full technology sharing, guaranteed trade terms, military cooperation, preferential treatment in disputed territories. Everything your superiors wanted you to ask for 6 months ago and more. Jake's mind reeled. Your Majesty, that's incredibly generous, but I don't understand why. Because your choice to ask for nothing showed me that humans might be the kind of allies worth having. The kind who see beyond immediate transactions to actual partnership, who value others' well-being even when it costs them something. She looked at him directly. Most species I negotiate with are calculating advantage, looking for ways to exploit opportunities. You looked for ways to help people who weren't even your responsibility. That kind of perspective is rare. There is one condition, Queen Lyriel added. You must be the primary ambassador. I trust your judgment, Ambassador Morrison. You saw what I could not see. You made a choice that benefited my people when you could have chosen benefit for yours. I want that kind of perspective representing humanity in our alliance. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified for that role. I'm a mid-level diplomat who got lucky once. You are a diplomat who had courage to do what was right despite knowing the personal cost, who valued compassion over calculation, who taught me more about leadership in one audience than centuries of tradition had managed. Her skin patterns blazed with determined gold. That makes you precisely qualified for this role. Jake looked out at the city below, transformed by a choice he'd made 6 months ago, by one moment of seeing need and refusing to ignore it. He thought about his demotion, about the months processing visa applications on Mars, about his superior's disappointment and anger. And he thought about Vela the teacher, showing her students a properly equipped classroom, about the medical workers who could now treat everyone who needed help, about ordinary Velorans living better lives because one human had made an uncomfortable choice. I accept, he said quietly, on the condition that I'm allowed to visit the lower districts regularly, to see how the improvements are progressing, to meet the people who benefit from the alliance we're building. Queen Lyriel's laugh was genuine and warm. Of course. Though I should warn you, Vela has been asking when you'll return. She wants to show you the new classroom personally. You may find yourself quite popular during those visits. I can live with that. The alliance was formalized over the following weeks. Comprehensive agreements that gave humanity more than they dared hope for when they'd sent Jake on his disastrous first mission. Technology transfers that would advance human civilization by generations. Trade terms that would bring prosperity. Military cooperation that would guarantee security. Territory rights that opened new opportunities for expansion. Everything his superiors had wanted, achieved not through strategic negotiation, but through one choice to help people who needed it. Jake's return to Earth was different this time. The officials who demoted him 6 months ago now couldn't stop congratulating him. Ambassador Chen apologized personally for doubting his judgment. The news coverage transformed him from idealistic fool to visionary diplomat, who'd somehow turned apparent disaster into humanity's greatest diplomatic triumph. How did you know it would work out this way? One reporter asked during a press conference. I didn't, Jake answered honestly. I made a choice that felt right, not because I expected reward, but because I couldn't do otherwise. The fact that it led to alliance was unexpected. But you must have calculated that helping the Veloran people would create goodwill. I didn't calculate anything. I saw people who needed help and had the ability to provide it. That's all. The reporter looked skeptical, probably thinking Jake was being falsely modest. But it was the truth. He'd made an uncomfortable choice because it was right, not because it was strategic. Though he had to admit the strategic outcome was better than anything he could have planned. Years passed. The human-Veloran alliance flourished, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than calculated advantage. Jake spent half his time on the Veloran homeworld, half on Earth, maintaining relationships and deepening cooperation between the species. He visited the lower districts regularly, watching as improvements continued and expanded. Vela the teacher became a friend, showing him her students' progress, introducing him to other teachers who'd benefited from the new educational funding. The medical workers he'd met that first day invited him to tour their upgraded facilities, showing him how many more people they could treat now. Queen Lyriel told him during one private conversation that she'd established a new principle in her government. Before any major military or expansion campaign, her advisors had to present plans for how domestic infrastructure would be maintained or improved. They called it the Morrison Principle, the idea that taking care of your own people was as important as expanding your power. "You changed how I rule, Ambassador," she said. "With one wish that asked for nothing for yourself, you taught me more about leadership than 500 years of tradition had managed." "I just made one choice," Jake said, as he'd said many times before. "One choice that mattered." Queen Lyriel's skin patterns glowed warm amber. One moment of seeing what was right and having courage to act on it, regardless of personal cost. That is wisdom, Ambassador Morrison. That is what earned your portrait in the Hall of Wisdom and your place as one of my most trusted advisors. 10 years after that first disastrous audience, Jake stood in the Hall of Wisdom looking at his own portrait. The artist had captured him as he'd been that day, young, uncertain, standing before the throne with determination despite obvious fear. The plaque beneath read, "Ambassador Jake Morrison of Earth, who taught us that true strength includes compassion, and that the wisest choice is sometimes to ask for nothing." "Still feels strange seeing myself on that wall," Jake said to Queen Lyriel, who joined him in the gallery. "You'll adjust. Besides, you've earned the honor." She gestured at the portraits around them. "These are the people who shaped how my dynasty rules, who taught us lessons we needed to learn. You belong among them. Because I got lucky once. Because you had wisdom to see what mattered and courage to act on it." Queen Lyriel's expression was fond now, after years of working together. "Stop diminishing what you accomplished. Your choice that day changed my empire for the better. Changed how I think about power and responsibility. Changed millions of lives." She smiled. "Except that you did something remarkable, Ambassador Morrison." Jake looked at the portrait, at the young diplomat who'd made an uncomfortable choice because it felt right, not knowing it would lead to everything that followed. "Okay," he said quietly, "maybe I did something remarkable." "Progress," Queen Lyriel's skin flashed amused gold, "only took you 10 years to accept it." They walked through the hall together, discussing upcoming diplomatic initiatives and shared projects. The alliance they'd built had become a model for human-alien cooperation, based not on exploitation or calculated advantage, but on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. And it all started because one diplomat stood before an alien queen and made an unexpected choice. Asked for nothing when he could have asked for anything. Chose compassion over strategy, chose to help people who needed it even though they weren't his people, chose right over advantageous. The alien queen had offered him anything he desired, expecting something grand or self-serving. Instead, his unexpected, humble choice had surprised her, taught her, and changed how she ruled her empire, proving that true character can astonish even the most powerful beings, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom is simply choosing to be kind when you could choose to be strategic.